In this section, you will be learning how to make a control dependent on user input in another control. To make this happen, you'll be using basic data binding. Data binding allows you to put dynamically updating content into your mobile forms. You can reference another control or reference data in a reference table with a query statement. The query statements use the SQLite SQL language. When the reference data changes, the value of the linked control is also updated. Because data binding is such a key technique, it's worth looking at its various types in detail before moving on with the Rocky Jupiter vehicle inspection form. Set up a new Solution Artifacts folder for the data binding tutorial. Name it, for example, Data Binding. Save the new forms in it. Name your first form example01.form.xml. Include the mandatory elements of the form. At the most basic end of the spectrum, data binding a control in a mobile form only takes an SQLite select query statement that returns a static result. Include the query statement in the reference attribute of the control that you bind to the returned data. If you put a string literal into the query, you effectively bind a static string into the control. This is what you did when you set up the segmented controls in the vehicle inspection form. Publish and open the form on your mobile device. It seems I mistyped an attribute. I'll correct it and publish the form again. You basically hard-coded the text for the text box. A static reference has its uses when you want to give a drop-down or a text box a default value, but it's not a very exciting technique. In the next example, you will link two controls with data binding. To make a control actually depend on user input in another control, put a parameter into the query statement that will stand in for the value of the referenced control, and declare the relative address of the control that you want to link to. The address is relative to the panel itself and moves up and sideways in the hierarchy, ending with the name of the referenced control. The parameter will dynamically take on the current value of the control that you address in the refarg attribute. If you reference one value, make the parameter @1 and use @2, @3, etc. for additional placeholders. Just remember that you need to put a relative address into the refarg for each of the parameters. Publish your solution. Enter any string in the text box and watch the label change. Some controls can display table values, that is, the result of a select query that returns multiple rows and/or multiple columns. A query returns multiple rows if the column in the table that it references has multiple rows. You can also get multiple rows if you combine static queries that return one row each with the union all operator. Each of the select queries in the code defines a table with one column and one row. The union all operator stitches them together to make a table expression with one column and 3 rows. Save the form, then publish and open on your mobile device. This is the same hard coding that you did for the Hello World text box, only this time the query returns a table expression and not a single string. When you query data with an SQLite select statement, you don't need to display whatever the query returns from the reference table as it is. You can make the query reorder, group, add to, or otherwise modify the reference data before the output appears in the form. A classic example of manipulating reference data in the query is filtering the selectable values in a drop-down based on what the user enters in the text box. To do this, add a text box to your form. Take the query from the previous example and filter it with a where clause. In the where clause, use the like SQLite operator to make the query return only the reference data that matches the user input in the text box. To reference the text box, you need the @1 parameter as a variable to hold the current value of the text box, and you also need to specify the path of the referenced control using the refarg attribute. Save and publish the form. On your mobile device, the Take Your Pick drop-down will only display the choices that start with the character or characters that you type into the text box above. A dynamic list control is where data binding really shines. A dynamic list control needs to be a panel because it needs child elements for a template. You have used the data type attribute in the code, so you'll want to know that the Mobilengine mobile form language is strongly typed. In the current version of the language, the typed equals true attribute is required on the form element. The date format and number format attributes are also required, and both are related to data typing. These specify how date and integer type values are parsed in the form. If the data type of the values in a control is different from the default type, you need to explicitly declare the data type of the allowed values. The default type for most controls is string, but there are some exceptions. The data type string means that the query references two columns that both have string type values. A dynamic list control does not simply display the results of its query statement like other controls, but generates an instance of its template, its child elements, once for each row returned by the query in its generator attribute. Save, publish, and open the form. Your combined query in the generator attribute returns a table expression with 3 rows, so template panel's child element gets generated 3 times. So here, the result of the query statement returns is not important, only the number of rows it returns. However, you normally query a reference table to display the data itself, not just the number of rows in it. To display the actual data, you need to reference the results of the query from inside the dynamic list control template. To do this, you use your familiar @1, @2, etc. parameters in the reference attribute. But in the refarg attribute, you need the parent.col_k construct, where k is the index of the column in the result set. Save, publish, and open the form as usual. The query in the dynamic list control returns a table expression with 3 rows and 2 columns. Every row in the result set generates the 2 label controls in the template once, so there will be 6 labels in total. The labels in the template reference and display the values of the first and second columns of the result set. The number and the values of the labels will update whenever the reference table is changed. If you reference a user-editable control in the dynamic list control's query statement to modify the returned values, You can let the user control what gets generated inside the dynamic list control. Add a text box to filter the returned values. Modify the query in the Dynamic List Controls Editor attribute. Add a where clause. In this way, your users can enter a few characters in the text box and will only see the relevant rows generated. Publish your solution. If you type a character in the text box, you will see the relevant rows. A dynamic list control generates its template as many times as the number of rows that its query statement returns. So if you set up the query statement to return 1 or 0 rows, you can make the template dynamically appear or disappear. In this example, you will create a checkbox and a dynamic list control. The dynamic list control references the checkbox. If the user checks the checkbox, the query returns 1 row, else the number of rows in the result set is 0. The template of the dynamic list control contains a simple label. Save, publish, and open the form. Select the Show the Template checkbox, and you will see the generated label. Let's get back to the vehicle inspection form of the Rocky Jupiter Company. You left off where you wanted to have the photo and description controls appear in the form only if the user taps the No answer in the linked segmented control. The task is basically the same as the last example. Put each of the text box photo control pairs inside a panel. Let's start with the description and photo for leaks. You know the generator and refarg attributes by now. The generator attributes query references the value of the segmented control via the @1 parameter. The refarg attribute specifies the relative path of the reference control. If the user selects No in the segmented control, the query returns 1 row and the text box photo control pair will be generated. I wrapped all the other text box photo control pairs in advance. Save the form and publish the solution. Open it on your phone. Let's give it a go. The text box and the photo control don't appear unless you tap No in a segmented control. Nice!